Russia spent a decade making Crimea unbeatable. The most advanced air defense systems in the Russian arsenal, nuclear submarines patrolling the approaches, and a fleet of warships that held every port in the Black Sea at risk. The peninsula was supposed to be invulnerable, and yet that fortress is being dismantled today, piece by piece, without a single soldier setting foot on the beach. Retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of U.S. Army forces in Europe, saw this coming before almost anyone else. His blueprint: 3 simultaneous phases: isolation, attrition, and economic strangulation, designed not to break Crimea's defenses, but to empty everything behind them until holding the peninsula becomes more painful than giving it up. If this campaign succeeds, it will not simply decide who wins in Ukraine. It will prove that a military conquest backed by a nuclear power can be reversed, and that changes the rules of geopolitical competition for every nation on Earth. It all starts with the map. The argument begins with the map. Crimea looks like a peninsula. Logistically, it functions like an island. Everything Russia's garrison needs to survive arrives through exactly 2 arteries. First, the Kerch Bridge, a 19-kilometer span crossing the Kerch Strait and the only rail link connecting the peninsula to Russia proper. Second, the M-17 highway corridor cutting south through occupied Ukrainian territory. Sever both, and Crimea is not merely difficult to supply, it becomes a cage. History has seen this before. In 1942, Singapore did not fall because its walls broke. It fell because its supply line did. 85,000 British soldiers surrendered 2 weeks after Japan severed their logistics chain. At Guadalcanal, Japan's garrison did not lose in firefights. It starved when the US Navy cut the resupply route the Japanese called the Tokyo Express. In both cases, the fortress held. The supply rooms emptied. That decided everything. Hodges has spent years making a single argument: you do not storm Crimea, you strangle it. Phase 1 is already measurably underway. Ukrainian drone strikes now reach the M-17 corridor with enough regularity to disrupt traffic and force rerouting. The pipeline that fed the peninsula's energy supply has been struck by sabotage. And the Black Sea Fleet, Russia's instrument of power projection into the Mediterranean and the Middle East, based in Sevastopol for more than 2 centuries, has been driven from port. The last warship departed Sevastopol Bay on July 15, 2024, pushed out by a sustained campaign of naval drone strikes and shore-launched missiles. 1/3 of the fleet had been sunk or damaged since 2022. The rest retreated to Novorossiysk across the sea, effectively sidelined. An entire fleet, not defeated in battle, but displaced. That is a different kind of humiliation, and arguably a deeper one. Phase 2 is the systematic destruction of Russia's eyes over the peninsula. On July 2, 2025, a maritime drone launched a swarm of aerial bombers that destroyed the nebo-m, Russia's most advanced long-range early warning radar, stationed near Cape Tarkankut in western Crimea. The radar was not damaged. It was reduced to wreckage. The sector it monitored went dark. A corridor opened across western Crimea that had not existed the day before. Ukrainian strike assets moved through it the same week. The economics of this exchange are what make it strategically ruinous for Moscow. A Ukrainian strike drone costs roughly $250,000. The Russian air defense systems it destroys cost $15 million or more per unit. Every exchange drains Russia's defense budget at a ratio that, compounded across hundreds of strikes, becomes structurally impossible to sustain. Phase 3 is the wider economic pressure. Ukrainian long-range drones have struck oil refineries deep inside Russian territory, degrading domestic refining capacity in increments that compound monthly. Russia's ability to sustain a Crimean garrison depends on fuel, logistics budgets, and supply chains that are shrinking under that sustained pressure. None of this would be possible without the coalition that expanded Ukraine's reach. The Storm Shadow, a British-French cruise missile capable of striking beyond 500 kilometers, hit the Black Sea Fleet's command headquarters in Sevastopol on September 22, 2023, during a senior leadership meeting. The building was abandoned the same afternoon. That single strike catalyzed the fleet's exodus from Crimea. The HIMARS, a truck-mounted precision rocket system, has since dismantled Russian railway junctions and ammunition depots feeding the peninsula from the north. F-16 multi-role fighters transferred from the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway now fly alongside Ukrainian pilots, adding a new category of aerial threat that forces Russian air defense operators to track aircraft they never previously encountered over Crimea. Each system applies pressure from a different vector. Together, they are converting Crimea from Russia's unsinkable aircraft carrier into something that increasingly resembles a besieged fortress running low on time. But what does it mean, strategically, politically, for the global order, when the most fortified territory in Europe begins to collapse not in flames, but in silence? It means Putin has walked into a trap his own success built. Every ruble committed to defending Crimea is a ruble stripped from the front in Donetsk and Zaporizhia. To reinforce Crimea's southern perimeter, Russia diverted airborne assault units from the Donetsk front. The Pokrovsk offensive, one of Russia's most ambitious ground pushes of 2024, stalled, in part because the forces needed to sustain it had been redirected south. Putin chose Crimea over Donetsk. Commanders do not make that choice from strength, they make it from fear. The historical parallel is unmistakable. At Stalingrad in 1942, Hitler refused to authorize a breakout for the encircled Sixth Army. He believed the Luftwaffe could supply the garrison by air. It could not. The army froze, starved, and surrendered. No one is arguing Crimea ends identically, but the structural logic is the same. A leader who cannot publicly release a territory he can no longer sustainably hold, because the political cost of withdrawal has already exceeded the military cost of staying until the moment it doesn't, and by then, there is no clean exit left. The political stakes explain why Moscow cannot move. Putin's approval ratings surged to 88% in the months following the 2014 annexation of Crimea, according to the Levada Center, Russia's independent polling agency. The peninsula was proof of concept for his entire governing narrative. Russia is a rising power that takes back what belongs to it. To yield Crimea is to dissolve that narrative. To publicly admit it is becoming unsustainable is to accelerate the dissolution. But the peninsula is already bleeding, and Russians are watching. The Kerch Bridge closes for hours when Ukrainian strike warnings are issued, stranding citizens on both sides of the strait. Property values in Sevastopol have fallen more than 40% since 2021. Coastal apartments sit unsold. Insurance companies no longer issue travel policies for the peninsula. Crimea was supposed to be the showcase of Putin's Russia, a vacation destination, a symbol of restored greatness. Today it is a militarized zone where property prices crater and men cannot escape the draft. Mobilization in Crimea is uniquely inescapable. When Russia announced partial mobilization in September 2022, hundreds of thousands of men fled to Kazakhstan, Georgia, and Armenia. In Crimea, those exits are closed. The bridge is monitored. The ferry has limited capacity. The northern border is a front line. Russian military bloggers have begun discussing openly how a potential civilian evacuation could even be organized. 2 million civilians, shrinking logistics, no viable corridor out. Mobilization on the peninsula is not a summons, it is a sentence with no appeal. The Mejlis, the elected assembly of the Crimean Tatars, the peninsula's indigenous people, has been banned since 2016. Home raids, arbitrary detentions, and cultural suppression have continued unabated under occupation, documented in detail by the UN Human Rights Council. Ukraine's argument for reclaiming Crimea is not only strategic, it carries an international evidentiary record that strengthens with each passing year of occupation. Beyond the peninsula's borders, the Black Sea itself sits at the center of a global food crisis. Before the 2022 invasion, Ukraine moved more than 90% of its grain exports by sea, through the ports of Odessa, Chornomorsk, and Pivdeny. Ukraine was among the world's largest exporters of wheat and sunflower oil. The food security of dozens of countries across Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia depended on those shipments. Russia's blockade severed the route. A temporary grain corridor provided relief until Moscow withdrew from the agreement in 2023. Ukraine has since established an alternative corridor along the western Black Sea coast, and exports have approached pre-war levels. But every ship on that route remains exposed for as long as Russia controls Crimea. Insurance premiums are elevated. The route is fragile. Sustainable, secure Black Sea trade requires the peninsula to change hands. And then there is the question that outlives the war itself. In 1994, Ukraine surrendered approximately 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads, the third largest nuclear arsenal on Earth, in exchange for security guarantees under the Budapest Memorandum, signed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. 20 years later, one of the three guarantors invaded. The other two condemned the invasion and imposed sanctions. No military force moved to recover the occupied territory. The memorandum remained ink on paper. The message that traveled to Tehran, Pyongyang, and Beijing was unambiguous. Give up your nuclear weapons, and your security assurances are worth nothing when tested. Every nuclear-armed state, and every state considering a weapons program, has been running that calculation ever since. A liberated Crimea begins to reverse it. An occupied Crimea deepens it indefinitely. If the trajectory is real, if the isolation is working, if the cost to Moscow is compounding day by day, what actually happens next? Hodges is precise about where the pressure leads. He does not pretend to control the clock. If Ukraine succeeds in permanently disabling the Kerch Bridge's rail section, something ATACMS ballistic missiles, capable of striking targets up to 300 kilometers away, are able to threaten. Heavy military resupply to Crimea collapses within weeks. Tanks, artillery, and bulk munitions move by rail. Without rail, they cannot move efficiently at all. The garrison does not immediately fall, but the count begins and cannot be stopped. Then the drone campaign continues to hollow out Russia's air defense network from the inside. Every radar that goes dark, every surface-to-air battery repositioned from the front to cover a gap near Sevastopol, every coverage void that opens is a corridor Ukraine exploits the same night. The aerial picture over Crimea dims week by week. At some point, the peninsula stops being defended and starts simply being endured. But that is only the beginning of the pressure chain. If Germany were to reverse course and supply the Taurus, a cruise missile engineered to strike hardened, fortified targets at ranges exceeding 500 kilometers, the calculus around the Kerch Bridge changes entirely. Chancellor Olaf Scholz has refused, citing escalation risks. That refusal has held. But Berlin's political calculations have shifted before, and if the strategic environment in Europe sharpens, a new Russian offensive, a NATO border incident, that decision could erode. Each delivery of a new long-range capability in this war has unlocked the debate about what comes after it. The Taurus remains the one weapon that could sever the bridge's rail section in a single coordinated strike, the kind of damage no repair crew patches in a month. And if that fails to produce a Russian withdrawal, if Moscow absorbs the logistical punishment and still refuses to yield, Hodges identifies where the next crisis emerges. Not in the Baltic states, sheltered under NATO's collective defense commitment. In the Caucasus, Georgia, the Caspian Corridor, regions outside any alliance protection, where Russia could take a slice every 5 to 10 years, never enough to trigger a collective military response, always enough to expand the perimeter. Hodges calls it salami slicing. And it continues for as long as the international community tolerates the precedent that Crimea's continued occupation represents. At the end of that chain sits the question no ceasefire proposal has answered and no negotiating table has resolved. Can a regime that built its legitimacy on territorial conquest negotiate its way out of the territory that made it legitimate? The structural answer, across every historical example, the Falklands recovered by force, Kuwait liberated by coalition, the Soviets withdrawing from Eastern Europe only after economic collapse, is the same. Occupied territory returns through military pressure or occupier exhaustion. It has never returned through negotiation alone. Hodges is direct. The momentum has shifted. But momentum is not victory. The direction is visible. The speed depends on factors neither side fully controls. The question now belongs to you. If the peninsula becomes truly untenable, if the logistics collapse, if the radar screens go dark, if the garrison can no longer be resupplied, does Putin withdraw and survive politically inside Russia, or does he escalate precisely to prevent that outcome? And if he escalates, at what point does the rest of the world stop calling this a regional conflict? And if the world hesitates to make that call when it should, what does that silence tell every nation that surrendered its nuclear weapons and is now watching this war to see whether that decision was the right one?